welcome to Breakouts in Outbreaks, the CHI Innovate webinar for 2020. We are starting today with a very interesting session on how COVID-19 has affected multiple industries and sectors across Singapore. I'm with someone now whose career over the years has traversed multiple industries through the military to R&D, education, and now food. Welcome to the interview, Mr. Lim Chuan. Mr. Lim is the chairman for the Singapore Food Agency, and I'd like to actually take you back in time if I can and sort of take you through your career where you've gone through all these various sectors. Can you think of innovations and new ideas that were sparked as a result of challenges or crises just like the one that we're facing now?
Right. Innovation has a very specific meaning when we use this in Singapore. So innovation is about creating value in a new way, of course. And it's important to distinguish this from just doing something new, but in fact, no one really values it. So it has to meet some societal needs or demand, very fundamental to how we think about innovation. I'm going to go beyond my own personal experience just to, allow us to connect to Singapore, because I think the best example for Singapore about innovation is actually Singapore itself, because Singapore itself is an innovation. And when you look at the amount of value that Singapore has created ever since independence, just over the last 55 years, we are now one of the highest per capita in the world. If this is not innovation, I don't know what is innovation. But it is not just about the economic side. It is in fact the entire socio-economic model that Singapore has innovated. And this has resulted in this high per capita GDP. But at the same time, this has also resulted in our governance and policy being studied. And in fact, many of them have adapted it in their own country. At the same time, we have in the process created institutions that are some of the most credible and capable. And of course, these are reflected in our public housing, our water, transportation, and very importantly in today's context, our healthcare sector as well. So we also have to ask, what is really driving this whole notion of Singapore as an innovation? So that was why I started with the definition. It has to meet some very fundamental need. And this is particularly important against the backdrop of COVID-19 crisis, because when you have a crisis, when you have a fundamental challenge, if you respond to it, that is almost the biggest catalyst, biggest spur for you to want to innovate. So for Singapore, it started off with the most basic of all, existential challenge. If you cannot innovate, you cannot survive, that's it. Good luck to you. So we were driven by the need to survive. How do you make a living? How do you live? And to do so, not just for today, but to do so in a way that is sustainable and, more importantly, aspirational, so that people will be excited by tomorrow and you know that there's a future for your next generation. So it's both sustainable and aspirational. And this, I think, has driven Singapore since independence till today. And this will exactly be the kind of issue that the next generation will have to think about, how to continue with this Singapore as innovation. Let me now, since I am part of the Singapore Food Agency, transit the example from this national level Singapore to SFA as a Singapore Food Agency as a recent example. Before, and of course today we are still by and large in that situation, Singapore import over 90% of our food. And we probably have less than 0.5% of our land set aside, to produce our own food. So that was before. But in the last, period of time, especially in the last 10 years, there are some very profound global changes, the global trends. So what has changed? I think the global trends are very clear. Based on the UN projection, the world's population is likely to be just shy of 10 billion in 30 years' time by the year 2050. This is 2.2 billion more than where we are today, which is 7.8 billion. So a lot of human activities, had to be generated just to meet these demands coming from this additional population. Arising from these human activities, in this positive feedback, you are going to have sea level rise, and the amount of arable land for producing food, in fact, will be diminished. So you are going to accelerate into a food security, drastic food security situation in a much faster way, accelerated way, unlike a linear projection. And there's also a relationship between these human activities and pandemics because of humans coming into closer proximity with animals, which is why nowadays we have a lot of exposure to zoonotic disease. So because of this very fundamental global trend, we need to ask ourselves, how we used to think about food security, is it still adequate? And this is really what drives the need for Singapore to rethink, and hence the creation of the Singapore Food Agency to ensure food security from farm to fork. Of course, we don't want to throw away what worked, which has always been a primary strategy of food import, supply, diversification. So that works, and we want to retain that. But then the question is, how can we enhance that? How can we make it more robust? Right. And because of these challenges globally and leading to supply shocks, this is why we felt that there's a need for significant, meaningful local production of food. So a very bold target was set, what we call 30 by 30, Singapore to produce 30% of our nutritional needs by the year 2030, coming from land space allocation for fruit, today of less than 1%. In fact, we're probably using about 0.5% today. Just to give you a sense of the stretch. If Singapore choose to produce food the same way that Germany does today, and they produce 90% of their food plus some export, we will need 18 more Singapore. This is the stretch. Okay. So obviously we cannot do it the same way the Germans are doing. We need to use very different approaches. Innovation has to come in a big way to meet these needs, of course, leveraging on science and technology. So one of the driving scenario, obviously for the creation of SFA, were the supply shock. And in fact, when we test it against our import diversification strategy, the one that will really have the global impact, interestingly, and obviously we are seeing this today, is a pandemic. So we ask ourselves today, in the middle of COVID-19, did it indeed create a kind of challenges that we anticipated? And in many sense, it has borne out. The good thing is just reassuring the audience here, and of course the wider public, is that by and large our food diversification strategy worked. That's why we all can still have our food. None of us are deprived of enough proteins and in fact highly enjoyable food. So by and large that strategy worked. But we have seen reactions by national government. Their first instinct because of this pandemic is keeping the supply to themselves as first priority. And sensibly so, they elected this government. Obviously, they respond to their own citizen first. So they hoard their supply. And medical supply is very evident. And some of them were, in fact, quite ugly in terms of hoarding of medical supply. But it has also gone to food, including in regional country. Even for countries that have abundance of food, there was a supply, momentary sort of disruption, simply because the whole supply chain, the logistic part of it, were disrupted. Ships were not exactly sailing the way they were. Aircraft used to, transport between flying passengers and the underbelly for cargo. Now you only have the underbelly, the passengers, disappeared. So all these were other challenges to the supply chain. But because of active management, in this case, SFA working very closely, MTI, and of course, MOT and the other agencies, we were able to, very short order of time, be able to bring the food in. But clearly, pandemic is a very major disruption to our food import diversification strategy as we sort of envisage this in our scenario. And it has borne out, but because of very proactive management. And of course, in the case of Singapore, we're able to stockpile a lot of our staple, for a very meaningful period. So we can deal with the food security in a way that, has not caused any discomfort to the population.
Well, this crisis and previous crises have always forced people and industries that don't normally work together to actually work together and collaborate. What are the difficulties and the challenges that you've sort of observed through the years and through the different crises as various sectors morphed and stepped up and partnered up to face challenges and crises?
I think this is the most pertinent question because if everyone behave appropriately, rightly, actually we are not expected to have crisis, but we are human society. We are fallible. That's why we have crisis. So very pertinent question. Let me read some data from the Worldometer, and this is accurate as 30th of June. I just want to mention the 5 countries with the greatest number of infections and deaths per million population, and then likewise the 5 countries with the least number of the same set of data. So, greatest number of infections per million population. It may surprise many people in this audience. US is there, but the US is not number 1. Number 1 is Qatar, 33,872. Number 2, Bahrain, 15,000 plus. Chile, 14,000 plus. Kuwait, 10,000 plus. And then the US, 8,103. Singapore, 7,005. One observation that you can almost pick up is that in a number of this country, a large part of the infection is actually with their migrant worker. Immediately, it calls upon a focus post-COVID that people have to address. And Singapore is already attempting to address this, even as we're responding to COVID. Least number of infections per million population, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, these are Southeast Asian countries. So there's a sort of proximity to the things that happened in this part of the world before. And then there's Angola. So these are countries that have infections per million of 3 to 8. Singapore, of course, in this region, but 7,005, that I mentioned earlier. These are the countries that actually have very low infections. And I think by and large accounted for with very strong measures upfront. Greatest number of deaths per million population is surprising, I think, to many because they all came from the West. Belgium, 841. UK, 642. Spain, 606. Sweden, 526. I believe we have a Swedish speaker here.
That's tomorrow.
That's right. Tomorrow. I think he has to prepare for response to this. France, 457. US in the same pack, but not exactly in the top 5, 389. Singapore, 4. Here, there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. Especially, these are all leading advanced economies. These are all countries with deep research capabilities. These are all countries that understand, infectious disease, And given the years of knowing what this pandemic can cause, why did they ended up with this set of outcomes, And each country is a bit different. But I think a study into this will be important so that hopefully it will not be repeated. Least number of deaths per million, Sri Lanka, Uzbekistan, Thailand, Ethiopia, and Zambia. These are all less than 1 or at 1. So why this different outcomes so far? That's a very important question. Here, I want to tease out the theme that you all have, which is leadership and innovation in crisis, into another branch of it, which is leadership and innovation for crisis, alongside leadership and innovation in crisis. So what is leadership and innovation for crisis? I asked my staff to do a check. If you go to Amazon, you actually can find 460 books written on the 1918 pandemic. And I, during this period of time, have read several of them, and I'll commend everyone to read the one by Laura Spinney, because the same issues that we face in intense way during COVID-19 were addressed in those books. Face mask issue. Why is face mask widely adopted in the East, but somehow, abhorred in other parts of the world? And the so-called effectiveness of face masks. And yet face mask is actually one of those issues that was work in progress throughout COVID-19. So this is something that I think we need to ask. It's an issue that ought to have been resolved even before the crisis. Likewise, naming of virus, again discussed in their book. And, we saw this episode playing out during this crisis. So there are 460 books. There's no shortage of knowledge for people to learn from. And also, according to WHO, following the 1918 pandemic, there were 4 more that were classified that way. Here, I'm using WHO definition. Pandemic is the worldwide spread of a new disease. So we have the 1957 Asian flu, 11 years later, 1968, the Hong Kong flu, and then 2003, SARS, and of course, 2009, swine flu. If there's any common pattern here, is that Asia is very well rehearsed because we've been afflicted, so it's in our instinct. And in fact, the common observation is that the countries that went through SARS 2003, they all have acquitted themselves so far very well in this SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19. Let me now move to leadership innovation in crisis. I just want to get to the point where we don't see leadership and innovation for crisis and leadership and innovation in crisis as different form of leadership innovation. It's actually on the same continuum. But there are obviously big urgency, contextual difference. The accentuated urgency because people are dying, and you got to be doing something and something fast and intelligent, and you got to be seen to be doing it, with that great sense of urgency. So there's that accentuated urgency because people are dying around you. And then, unfortunately, you'll be operating in an environment where there's so much uncertainty because you don't exactly know what this virus is. And you don't exactly know the disease biology. So the only sensible thing is to fully leverage on what you have built up before. And the most crucial part is actually not the capabilities per se, but the confidence and trust that you have with the people. Because, there will be gaps and you want them to trust you and have confidence in your solutions and be patient, in allowing the right solutions to emerge. So this is really the most critical thing, confidence and trust. And this applies to all sectors, all industry, not just for the political side. And therefore, for the leaders, there's this single-minded focus by whoever that's running this whole effort to sustain this trust and confidence. At any point, when you are seen as lying, when you are seen as not speaking to evidence and authentic science, you lose credibility, and no one will believe in what you say. Worse, you actually can cause a lot of deaths. The big challenge in responding to the crisis is how to stay open to allow for your own mindset to be challenged and be prepared to change your paradigm. I think if you were to do a study later on the face mask issue, you'll find that, at some point, it moved from evidence-based to a mindset, and it took a lot more evidence before people were prepared to change. Leadership, and this one cannot be underscored enough. Where is the leadership presence? especially where it's most uncertain, where it's most dangerous. The people that is really having to face the greatest risk, they get really motivated. Their morale will be sustained when there's leadership presence. And this is a very human element of it. And this is not about innovation. It's just, you need to be there, so that they know that you care. They know that you value what they are doing. They know that, you have their backs and you're going to give them all the support.
Right. If you've just joined us, welcome to the first session of CHI Innovate webinar. And I'm talking to Mr. Lim Chuan Po, the chairman for the Singapore Food Agency. Mr. Lim, it's time to get a little bit more personal about your own leadership style and how it's changed over the years as you've moved from industry to industry. There are many people who have always said that a military man cannot or will find difficulty adapting his leadership style to other industries, but you're an example to counter that as well. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how your style has sort of changed as you've moved from sector to sector over the years.
So let me start with something more academic, definition in my own book. I see leadership as the ability to use the authority and resources available to you to influence, and this is the operative word, to influence, not to direct, but to influence a group of people to undertake a task that they otherwise would not spontaneously do. But obviously, if you want to be more effective, there's a need to take into account the cultural context. What you can, under a certain abbreviated way of thinking about this, the lingo, what is your language? Or you can use the word culture of the place. So for me, because I have to cross from the Singapore Armed Forces to the Ministry of Education, and then running A-Star, which is a community of very top and eminent scientists and researchers, 5,000 of them. And of course, now with the Singapore Food Agency, there are obviously very significant cultural differences arising from the nature of the organization. The SCF, of course, is command and control, mission-oriented. You cannot spend time, having this deep deliberation over the mission that's given to you, because after you finish 5 hours or 5 days of that, mission is over, war is over. When I transited to a Ministry of Education, I think the thing that I invested the most time to really, allow myself to over time become effective is to learn about the culture. And you cannot learn about a culture by asking for staff papers and read the staff papers, because this will be very filtered information. A large part of that is allowing yourself to be immersed with them. So the initial period of my transition to the Ministry of Education was really invested in going down to the schools, going down to the schools, visiting the schools, obviously observe their programs and so on. But the most insightful, valuable, and a big learning for me is when I have the conversation with the teachers, with the students, because you picked up, the nuances, you really know what they value, and you know the cultural aspect of the entire setup. So over a period of time, once you start appreciating this, when you engage them, you are not just communicating, you are connecting with them. The same thing happened when I have to transit to A-Star. If there's one thing that researchers, scientists almost instinctively had a reaction against, it is subject to regimentation. So I still remember a very senior person in our system, firstly asking me to chair A-Star, at the same time saying that I don't think the fact that you have a military background will be welcome. So that was a very warm welcome. But precisely because you are aware of this, you invest a lot of time to really understand, what connects, what resonates with the scientists. And I knew that I've been received by them when one day, one of the leading scientists very proudly introduced my military background, because it became a source of pride, that I came from the military rather than, how come we have a military person running a research organization. But I cannot, of course, say that applies to everyone in the organization. I'm sure there'll be many other people with differing views. But, one of these, international top scientists actually said that. To me, it was a good feedback. So the cultural element, cannot be underestimated. And I guess this is true for anyone, moving from an area where they have deep understanding, deep domain knowledge to another domain. So it's not, in some sense, unique, except that in my case, it's a much bigger jump, from one to the other. Let me share with you an insight that I gained arising from my work in A-Star, and I spent time trying to learn from others who had to run a research organization. So I visited Boston, spent time at MIT. I will not narrow down to the specific institution, but the conversation ensued. And then we were focused on one topic: how do you get scientists to collaborate? And of course, clinicians are not too different from scientists. So you can take home whatever lessons you want from this sharing. So this very brilliant young scientific leader in MIT realized that if only he can bring some of the luminaries together into a room and then engage in a conversation, he should be able to identify some of the most interesting areas, direction of research, and everyone can benefit from this. So he shared this idea, and then people say, yeah, good idea. So at the Faithful event, over 70 of the top people responded, and they turned up physically, interacting and then, brainstorming, and then, a lot of conversation. And of course, amongst the very open-minded scientific community, people are prepared to challenge each other, politely or impolitely, it doesn't matter. So there's a lot of divergence, as they also have convergence. And he collected all the points over 2 days, and then he reflected on them after the session. And the thing that struck him, and he was not prepared for this, is that he brought some of the best people in the country, and this is the US, and of course the scientists came from all the different parts of the world. They all happen to, do their best research in the US. So he said, these are the top people in the US. Yet I don't get the sense that, the derived topics, areas of research are really pushing the envelope. So it was puzzling to him. So he decided to take this issue to someone who is a lot more senior than him, but very eminent, and said, look, we just went through this, why do you think we have this situation? I got the brightest people together, but they did not come back with the brightest ideas.
A bit of a disappointment too, I'm sure, yeah.
Can you imagine you're pursuing a direction? Imagine you are Jennifer Doudna, you are working on CRISPR-Cas9. Yes. Would you go around town and say, oh, this is the hottest topic? Of course not. You want to have your publication, put your stamp on it.
Yes.
Even then, you may not necessarily share your X recipe. Yes. So there is that element inside that dynamic. Right. So he said, okay. And then he went back to think about how to get around this problem. And that's where I benefited from him. So he decided to repeat the whole experiment again, but he took a totally different approach. This time, he started with 2 or 3 people. There were some very clearly complementary and somewhat orthogonal to his own area of research. So you are not competitors. Right. And discuss with them, how they want to do this to get their commitment to do it. So they became the nucleus, and this nucleate others that they think can contribute in a way that will be constructive and will bring the whole endeavor forward. So using this process, very careful ink blot, by the time he did the second event, they got fantastic ideas.
Now, I think all of us have reached that stage in this particular pandemic where we're perhaps starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully, and many people are now starting to look ahead and wonder what that new norm is going to be. And I'd like to ask you at this point in time, what are your thoughts for how leaders of industry, leaders of innovation should start to think about to position themselves and their organizations for this new future?
But let me first contextualize pandemic. When you think about the 4 quadrants in terms of known all the way to unknown, pandemic is actually a known unknown. You know it's going to happen, and from the first one that's very well documented, 1918 pandemic, this is just a matter of time, when, not if. So it's a known unknown. So we should not think that this is something that will completely change everything that we do, how we live, and how we make a living. It will have impact, of course, and there will be time for us to draw the appropriate lessons. And let me just use 3 broad categories of the so-called entities, especially the business entities. Even within this pandemic, there are those that really prospered. So it's not as though everyone suffered. They prospered because they had exactly the right platform, that the demand of them will boom because of the inability to have physical engagement. So anything that's in the cyberspace, in the digital space, the right capability, right offerings, right services at the right time. Which is why the people that founded Zoom, they are now zooming, away. So for these entities, in some sense, you may think that there's a lot less to think about post COVID-19, because the obvious thing is just continue doing what they are doing because it's so successful. I actually hold a slightly different view. I think for these entities, because precisely they were doing so well during the pandemic, they have the least clarity of how to think about their future. Obviously, there's the formula that is working well, but the uppermost in their mind must be, what will be the kind of disruption that will in fact, make their offerings, their business, irrelevant. And they had to start thinking about this. Just to illustrate, some of these things are not immediately obvious. Everyone assumed that Amazon, because of COVID-19, in terms of revenues, it went up, so profits must have gone up. But the reality is actually for Amazon, profits went down. The share price went up only because of the whole wave of liquidity. It's not because of the actual margin. And they actually had to build a lot of capabilities within their physical fulfillment for safe distancing, or in the case of US, social distancing, to make sure that it is a COVID-19 proof. And in fact, they actually had a lot of labor reaction to the unsafe measure. So that increased the cost, and they are just, responding to that. But even then, it's something that they can fix. More important is what will disrupt that model. But they are making a big money, so I have to leave it to them to put their minds to deal with that issue. There are, of course, those that have done very well all this while, national level, business, and so on, and managed to ride through COVID-19 in a relatively calm, sensible way. And Singapore is one of them. We did not have to incur a lot of debt just to see through this period in order not to burden the next generation. But the socio-economic model, the innovation that is Singapore, I think needs to be relooked simply because the world is changing. And it's not because of the pandemic, but because against the backdrop of the pandemic, there are bigger forces that are already being reshaped. The US-China relations bring about this move towards deglobalisation and straddling all the way from trade to technology is obliging the different countries to then have to decide, which part of this deglobalizing effort do you want to be, or you evolve a new arrangements? In some sense, this is related to what I say about the first group. They need to ask themselves what will disrupt them. Deglobalization is disruptive to the Singapore success story. We have always prospered because we are connected and because we are very, very effective and efficient in doing this connection. That's why we have this relevant value and place in the global community. But if the world goes deglobalized, so how do we find that new position? So there's a lot of thinking to be done, and this will have very profound impact in our socio-economic model. And this will apply to a number of others that somehow manage to get through this period, but need to ask themselves, can this continue the same way as it was before, or it has to be done differently? Another dimension that's already coming out is investing and building business that are more ESG compliant. This is in terms of environment, in terms of social, in terms of governance. Obviously a lot of regard given to the climate change challenge. And a lot of these are now turning into substantive action. And this also applies to country. So there's a lot of these matters that we need to think about. They're related, but not driven just because of the pandemic. Then, of course, there are those that are really struggling. They have hard choices to make. Do they remain where they are, or they fundamentally move into new areas or reinvent their business model? But very profound, not just because of the pandemic, but never waste a good crisis. Make use of the urgency, the impetus arising from this, to do the right thing, towards the later part of the crisis, and then certainly, as everyone emerge from this COVID-19. And I just want to say that one area that the leadership, especially beyond the healthcare professional and the research community, have to pay attention to is, what enables Singapore to respond to the COVID-19, with the app, with the test kit, with the vaccine, with the therapy, with the very effective care and treatment for the patients. It's because we have invested in this capability. So that investment have to continue, taking into account, of course, other priorities.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Lim. You've brought us through your very, very broad and deep career, and you've given us a lot of your personal leadership perspectives and insights as well. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Thank you.
So thank you very much for having me. You are doing a great job. Singapore is able to, be where we are right now in this crisis. Very, very low mortality and very heartwarming stories of patients recovering. Is because of everyone, in this virtually present audience, and of course many more in the other healthcare clusters. So I salute all of you for your effort. Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Don't go away. Coming up next, healthcare meets F&B, transport, tourism, and aviation. What innovations in those industries can we learn from? And perhaps can healthcare teach the other industries something about how we've been handling COVID-19? So join Dr. Chuan as he meets the industry leaders from those sectors in the next panel.